Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we try to cut through the noise and give you the really essential knowledge fast. We know you're curious about how ancient folks didn't just survive, but actually managed, well, real luxury. And today we're diving deep, really deep into one of the most amazing achievements of the ancient world, the public bathhouse. Our mission today is, well, it's a proper deep dive into ancient public bathing. We're going to trace the whole story, from the pretty simple beginnings in Greece all the way up to those huge, sprawling Roman Thermae. We really want to figure out how something as basic as washing yourself turned into this massive, complex thing.
Exactly. And our job here is to unpack how these places worked, because they were so much more than just places to get clean. We're digging into the vital facts, how they functioned as these complex architectural ecosystems. They were completely central to Roman identity, to their politics, and, crucially, to their incredible water and heating tech. When you look at the sources, you see this really fascinating tension. On one hand, you've got subsidized comfort for pretty much everyone, but it's all built on this foundation of massive engineering projects and, frankly, intense labor exploitation.
That tension, yeah, that's the core of it, isn't it? Watching how this basic need for hygiene just balloons into this grand, publicly funded spectacle of imperial might. It's like the ultimate infrastructure project, designed to shout, look, the empire even washes better than anyone else. Okay, let's unpack this incredible achievement, and eventually how it all fell apart.
Right. So to really appreciate what the Romans did, we kind of have to set the stage. Look at where it all started back in ancient Greece. The whole idea of communal bathing, its institutional roots, they lie in this pretty modest, very functional Greek structures called Balaneia.
And those early Greek baths, they weren't really standalone places for chilling out, were they? They were fundamentally connected to physical training, like part of the gymnasium or the palastra. It sounds like it was mostly about recovering after exercise, not so much about hanging out.
Precisely. Early Greek bathing was extremely utilitarian. And this focus on function, it explains why warm water itself was seen as, well, a big deal, a luxury. Our sources, like the Homeric epics, they mention warm water as a specific reward, often just for heroes coming back from battle. That tells you straight away how much effort and resources it took just to heat water back then.
So what did the buildings themselves look like? I'm picturing something much smaller, much simpler than those giant Roman halls.
Oh, way more contained. And specialized. The Greek Balaneia were all about functional simplicity. Architecturally, they often used round rooms, called tholoi. And that round shape wasn't just for looks, it was probably functional too, likely helped keep the heat in, fewer outside walls, keeping the limited warmth sort of centralized.
Okay, so what was actually inside these round rooms? What kind of tubs or basins?
Mostly you'd find rows of simple marble basins for cold water washing, or these single-person hip baths, sometimes called sitz baths. They had built-in seats. You only submerged your lower body, really. It emphasizes efficiency over, luxurious soaking. Bigger tubs for full immersion came later, but the basic idea stayed focused on individual use, not a big communal show.
And heating. If they wanted warm water, how did they manage that before the Romans came along with their fancy systems? Was there any kind of early underfloor heating?
Yes, but it was pretty basic. Rudimentary, really. The heating tech was not sophisticated. For the larger pools, the alveae, some Hellenistic sites, show what you could call a proto-hypocaust. It was basically just a single underground channel, maybe a simple duct, heated by a furnace room next door. But, and this is key, unlike the later Roman system, this early method gave very little control, the circulation was poor, and often it only really heated the floor right near the channel itself. Pretty inefficient for heating big rooms properly.
And the cost. That tells a big part of the story too, doesn't it? Especially when you compare it to Rome later on. There was a real price to pay, even if it seems small now.
Absolutely. In Greece, whether these places were run publicly or privately, you had to pay an entry fee. Small, maybe, but significant. Something like 2 chalkoi, which was about a quarter of an obol. Now, an obol was roughly the daily wage for a very low-skilled worker. So paying a quarter of your day's wages just to take a bath. Well, it reflects that utilitarian sort of decentralized idea. You pay for the service you use, and that economic model is a really stark contrast to the Roman approach, where the fee basically became symbolic, often subsidized by the state. It signals this huge shift towards, strategic government investment in public well-being and showing off imperial power.
Right, that shift from pay-for-service to subsidized spectacle is just enormous. The Romans grabbed this basic Greek idea and then just explode it.
Yeah.
Building these colossal stone ecosystems all over the empire.
And that transition means we need to get the Roman terms straight, because they actually made a point of distinguishing between two types of bathhouses based on size and, importantly, who paid for them.
Ah, yes, the critical difference between Balaneia and Thermae.
Exactly. Balaneia generally meant the smaller places, lots of them, often local, serving a neighborhood or maybe a big private house. But the term thermae, which comes from the Greek word thermos, meaning hot, that term popped up around the 1st century AD. And it specifically meant those massive, palace-like, super luxurious complexes built by the emperors.
And the scale.
Oh,
Yeah, you really can't overstate it. It was absolutely an intentional political tool. We're talking about buildings that basically redefined monumental architecture.
The scale was the message. Think about the Baths of Caracalla, built between 212 and 216 AD, famous for having hundreds of statues, huge halls lined with expensive imported marble, massive vaulted ceilings. Just incredible. And then you look at the Baths of Diocletian, which were even bigger, designed to hold something like 3,000 bathers at the same time. That sheer size, the grandeur, it was all meant to inspire awe, you know, to show off the limitless resources of the empire.
So this leads right into the idea of infrastructure as propaganda. These thermae were strategic political statements. They were heavily subsidized, right? The entry fee was tiny, maybe a single coin, more like a token than a real price. And they got preferential treatment for water supply, practically unlimited. It was a physical demonstration of imperial generosity, their largesse.
It was a pretty sophisticated ideological move, really aimed at, well, social engineering. The bathhouse became totally fundamental to the Roman idea of what it meant to be a citizen, part of Roman identity. The sources actually show that the law itself defined the ideal Roman day, partly by location. A Roman was someone who conducts business, visited the forum and the theater, celebrates religious festivals, and goes to the baths. It went from being just an amenity to basically a non-negotiable civic right, and yeah, almost a political duty.
And they exported this definition of civilization everywhere they went, into every conquered territory.
Oh yes, building these thermae in places they conquered, whether it was, Wroxeter up in chilly Britain or Timgad down in dry North Africa, it served a key purpose. It was about showcasing Roman daily civilization, their material culture. These huge complexes were often paid for by wealthy local elites, maintained by the town council, but provided to the public at minimal cost. It was the empire basically saying, look at the amazing benefits of Roman rule. This is the physical standard of our superior way of life. It reinforced architecturally what it meant to be Roman, and it visually confirmed the supposed upsides of becoming part of the empire for everyone living there, no matter where they originally came from.
Okay, the idea of 3,000 people soaking, sweating, and plunging all at once every single afternoon. That needs logistics on a scale we still found challenging today. The whole operation of the thermae absolutely depended on incredibly sophisticated water engineering, all gravity-fed.
The amount of water needed every day was just immense. These huge imperial baths couldn't just rely on local wells. They needed massive aqueduct systems, sometimes stretching dozens of miles, pulling water from natural springs high up in the hills.
And these aqueducts, they're the ultimate proof of Roman practical physics, aren't they? Moving unbelievable amounts of water just using gravity.
Exactly. The water flowed down channels made of stone, brick, or concrete, and they had to maintain this tiny, almost invisible downward slope, often just a few inches per mile, across incredibly varied landscapes. The real skill was keeping that continuous, gentle slope going. Our sources detail the infrastructure they used to ensure the water quality and control the distribution, too. They had sedimentation tanks at points along the way, basically to let debris settle out naturally before the water even got into the city pipes.
And then distributing it within the city, that required complex management, too.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like turning on a giant tap for the whole city.
No, not at all. The water flowed into these distribution tanks, the Castella Aquae. Think of them as massive civic water towers, strategically placed, often elevated. From these tanks, the final gravity-fed network branched out. And crucially, they used stopcocks and carefully sized outflow pipes to regulate the pressure and the volume going to different parts of the city. This ensured a smooth flow and stopped pipes bursting in the lower parts of town.
Which brings us back to how they allocated the water. The forces are really clear that underneath all the luxury of the baths, there was a very practical, very strict priority system.
Yes, and this hierarchy really shows the political reality. Priority 1, public fountains. Absolutely critical for drinking water, basic survival. That always came first. Priority 2 was the public baths. These were classed under civic wellness, a political necessity. Only after those two essential needs were met did the water supply go to the third category. Wealthier private users and businesses who paid fees. This was actually codified. If water levels dropped because of a drought, the private users were the first to get cut off. It really shows how invested the state was in the public infrastructure over private luxury.
That's fascinating. I bet that allocation system caused some arguments, though. Did wealthy people try to cheat the system or, like, bribe the water officials, the curator aquarium for better access?
Oh, absolutely. The sources, especially legal texts and recorded complaints, are full of evidence of people illegally tapping into the main aqueduct lines, trying to bypass the official distribution tanks. Private citizens, desperate for a constant supply for their own little baths or fancy gardens, would definitely try to bribe officials. It was this constant battle, you know. The public system prioritized the masses, but the elite were always pushing for private access.
And we can't forget the really clever recycling part, can we? The relatively clean runoff water from the baths played a final vital role in keeping the city clean.
Yes, this is a brilliant example of integrated urban planning. The overflow from the cold pools, the frigidarium, and the used water from the big swimming pools, which was dirty, but not sewage. It wasn't just wasted, it was plugged back into the city's water cycle. First, it was often directed to industries that needed lots of water, like fulling, cleaning wool, and dyeing. But most importantly, it flowed down special channels, mixed with the gray water from the public toilets, the lavatrina. And this combined flow provided the speed and volume needed to scour the public sewers and drains, including Rome's enormous main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima. So the baths weren't just for washing people, they were literally the engine cleaning the entire city's waste system. Hashtag 2.2, the hypocaust revolution.
Okay, so the water logistics are one miracle.
Right.
But actually heating these places, that's a whole other level. The hypocaust system, literally heated from below, that's the core technology that let the Romans keep different temperatures in multiple huge rooms all at the same time.
It's arguably one of the most foundational bits of Roman engineering. The basic idea was to heat air, which then heated stone, which then radiated heat into these massive spaces. Simple concept, incredibly complex execution.
So walk us through how it worked exactly. How did they raise the floor and how did they spread the heat around?
Okay, so it started by raising the main floor of the room, maybe 2 or 3 feet, on top of hundreds of little pillars. These pillars, called pilae, were usually made from stacks of small, square bricks or concrete pieces, all mortared together. This created this huge, hollow space, a plenum, underneath the entire floor. Then, hot air, smoke, and exhaust fumes from a furnace room next door, the prefernium, where a fire burned continuously, were channeled directly into this underfloor space.
Right, but just heating the floor wouldn't be enough, would it? The heat needed to get up into the room, and the smoke needed to get out without just baking people's feet.
Exactly, and that's where the clever part with the walls comes in. They didn't just rely on the floor radiating heat upwards, they built chimney-like channels right into the walls. Often they used these special hollow tiles, square or rectangular ceramic tiles called box tiles or tubulae. So the hot air and smoke rose from the underfloor space, went into the hollow space inside these wall tiles, circulated upwards, heating the walls as it went, and finally escaped through vents near the ceiling.
What was so special about those box tiles? Why not just leave gaps in the walls?
The box tiles were brilliant for several reasons. First, they massively increased the surface area radiating heat into the room. Instead of just the floor, now you had the walls radiating heat too. Second, by circulating heat up the walls, they stopped the edges of the room from getting cold or damp. Third, and this is really important, they kept the air moving. Without these flues drawing the hot air upwards, the underfloor space would have just baked the floor unevenly. The box tiles ensured this comprehensive, pretty even distribution of heat throughout the entire room. That's how they got the Caldarium so intensely hot and steamy.
That detail really hits home how intense it must have been. And this whole system was integrated, right? It heated the water for the pools at the same time.
Yes, the dual function was absolutely essential. The very same fire roaring in the prefernium to heat the air for the hypocaust also heated huge bronze or lead boilers placed right above the flames. Our sources show they typically had 3 interconnected tanks. One for hot water, Caldarium tank, one for warm, Tepidarium tank, and one holding cold reserve water, Frigidarium tank. Lead pipes connected these tanks, and the bath operators, using sophisticated bronze valves, could mix the hot and cold water streams on demand. This let them get the temperature just right for the different pools, and for the labrum, that's the hot water basin usually found inside the Caldarium.
It all sounds incredibly efficient and comfortable, but the sources really hammer home the massive cost behind it. All the non-stop, intense work needed to keep this system running.
And that's the central paradox, isn't it? Comfort for the citizens was bought with relentless, back-breaking labor. This amazing technology needed constant attention. The furnace had to be stoked 247 while the baths were open. It consumed unbelievable amounts of wood fuel, often shipped in from vast imperial forests far away. The sheer volume of wood burned every day, especially in the really big complexes like Diocletian's, must have been staggering. And this entire operation, chopping wood, hauling it, stoking fires, managing heat, was done by low-status workers, mostly slaves. It really highlights how fragile and, frankly, unsustainable the Thermae were without that powerful imperial administration constantly managing resources and exploiting labor.
So going to a Roman bath wasn't just a quick dip. It was like a whole formalized ritual, right? It took hours, and it was carefully choreographed for health, socializing, and relaxation.
Absolutely. The journey started the moment you walked in, usually into the Apodyterium, that was the dressing room, often a pretty fancy hall with little niches or cubbies where you take off your clothes.
And leaving your clothes with an attendant kept serious that wasn't just optional, was it? It sounds like it was basically required for security in such a busy public place.
Oh, essential. Theft was apparently a huge problem in bathhouses, so the attendant was your main defense against losing your tunic. The entrance areas often had nice decorations too, like floor mosaics, sometimes inscriptions to set the mood. Sources mention mosaics saying things like bene lava, wash well, or showing playful scenes of bathers.
Okay, so you're stripped down. Then the ritual often kicked off with exercise out in the palestra, the big open-air exercise ground. Was that, mandatory?
It was definitely considered a vital part of the process for good health. The idea was to get a sweat going, warm up the muscles before hitting the heat. People would do running, lift weights, wrestle, play ball games, throw the discus. This pre-bath workout was also a deliberate break, physically and mentally, from the day's work, what they called Negotium, or business. For the upper classes, the workday often finished around lunchtime, so they had the whole afternoon free for this leisurely, multi-hour bath visit, starting with some pretty intense exercise. Hashtag 3.2, the graduated thermal ritual. Right, then the core of the experience was moving carefully through the different heated rooms. It was designed to maximize sweating and let your body adjust gradually. The exact order could vary, but each room had a specific purpose.
So if we follow the most common route, what were the key rooms in that progression from cool to super hot?
Well, often they'd work in the frigidarium, the cold room, either near the beginning or right at the end. This room had the cold plunge pool, known by various names like natatorium, piscina, or baptisterium. If you used it early on, the icy water was meant to be stimulating. If you used it at the end, it was that final bracing shock to close your pores and cool down.
Okay, then you'd start moving towards the heat, but not straight into the hottest room, right? There was an intermediate step.
Correct. Next usually came the tepidarium, the warm intermediate room. This space was really crucial for acclimatization. It let your body get used to the rising temperature and humidity without the shock of going straight into the main heat. Interestingly, the tepidarium was often the most ornately decorated room. It seems it was used more for just hanging out, chatting, socializing, rather than intense washing, kind of like a warm lounge.
Which then prepared you for the main event, the Caldarium.
Exactly. The Caldarium was the peak of the heat experience. The hottest, steamiest room, heated directly by the hypocaust, radiating up through the floor and walls. This was where he did the serious sweating. The steam treatment really opened up the pores for purification. It almost always had a large, built-in, hot plunge bath, the labrum, usually at the far end. And for people who preferred a dry heat, like a sauna, some bath had a small alternative room called the laconicum. Very intense dry heat.
And after going through all that heat, you'd work your way back down, often finishing with another cold plunge in the frigidarium before heading back to the dressing room to get your clothes. Hashtag 3.3, the strigil and the theater of status. Okay, so once you're thoroughly sweat-soaked and sort of cooked by the heat, it's time for the actual cleaning. We know they didn't really use soap like we do.
Right.
So how did they get properly clean?
They used oil, usually olive oil, maybe mixed with perfumes or other things. You'd rub this oil all over your skin. The heat and sweat had already opened up your pores, so the idea was the oil would kind of dissolve and lift up the dirt, dust, and grime that your body had sweated out.
And then came the key tool of the Roman bath, that famous or maybe infamous strigil.
The strigil, yes. It was this curved metal tool, usually made of bronze or iron. It had a sort of dull, scooped blade on the end and a handle. The final essential step in cleaning was using the strigil to meticulously scrape off that layer of dirty oil, sweat, and skin debris. And this scraping process, it was highly visible, very public.
Right, and this is where that idea of the bathhouse being a leveling ground kind of falls apart, isn't it? This basic act of hygiene became a really obvious public display of your social status.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone could scrape themselves, but the act of self-scraping, that immediately marked you as someone maybe of lower status, or at least someone who couldn't afford help. The truly wealthy, the elite, they showed off their status by having a specialized slave, sometimes called a service, a balneo, do the scraping for them. It was a public performance of dependency and leisure.
But hang on, if the baths were supposed to be this ultimate democratic space, wasn't it a bit awkward for the elite to be demonstrating their total reliance on slaves right when they were at their most vulnerable naked?
It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? The nudity created this illusion of equality, everyone's physically the same. But then the master being tended to by the slave, that instantly snaps the hierarchy back into place. The slave wasn't there as a bather, they were a tool, an instrument of purification. And our sources give us that great anecdote about the Emperor Hadrian that illustrates this perfectly.
Yeah, tell us that story again. It really shows how the money hierarchy just couldn't be hidden.
Right. So Hadrian is in the baths one day, and he sees this old soldier, a veteran, awkwardly trying to scrape his own back by rubbing it against a marble wall in the Caldarium. Hadrian asks him, why are you doing that? And the soldier admits he can't afford an attendant, a slave, to scrape him properly. So Hadrian, recognizing the man's service, gives him enough money on the spot to hire his own bath attendant. Great gesture, right? But the next day, Hadrian comes back to the baths, and he's suddenly surrounded by dozens of old guys, all vigorously rubbing their backs against the walls, clearly hoping for the same imperial handout.
Huh. That's brilliant. But yeah, it totally underlines the point. The strigil scraping wasn't just cleaning, it was a highly visible social marker. It turned a private act into a public display of the economic reality, the labor hierarchy, that existed no matter how cheap the entry fee was.
So we really have to keep emphasizing that these thermae, they were the absolute architectural embodiment of Roman city life. They brilliantly mixed personal downtime, otium, with civic duty and business negotium.
Yeah, they were promoted as the ultimate social hub.
Yeah.
Because the cost was so low, they were often presented as this great social leveler, a place where citizens of all classes could rub shoulders, gossip, relax, build a sense of community.
And the civic role wasn't just talk, it was deeply embedded in Roman life. The mix of leisure and business was so complete that Roman law and custom basically put going to the baths on the same level as going to the forum or the theater. It was that important. Politicians, officials, they constantly used the baths as meeting places. Deals were struck while exercising or cooling down after the steam rooms. Merchants used the spaces to conduct business. It was really the main hub where the city's political and economic life played out every afternoon.
But that idea of a complete leveling ground where all social barriers just vanished, that feels a bit too good to be true, given how rigid Roman society was.
It was definitely a powerful idea, a useful illusion, but yeah, structurally limited. While the main pools and the big exercise areas, the palæstra, were generally shared spaces, access to other parts of these huge imperial complexes was often strictly controlled based on your status. So you might have private meeting rooms, exclusive library wings, or maybe smaller, fancier pools reserved just for senators or high officials. And beyond class, gender and slave status absolutely dictated where you could go. There were almost always separate, much less grand facilities for slaves, and often separate times or areas for women. So yes, hierarchy definitely persisted, even right in the heart of this supposed communal space.
So just because people were in the same building didn't mean they were having the same experience or were truly equal.
Not at all. They might share the same air, maybe bump into each other, but they weren't necessarily using the same amenities or even there for the same reason. The elite were often there for negotium, doing deals, networking, reinforcing power, while the average person was more likely there for basic hygiene and simple relaxation. Hashtag 4.2, gender, nudity, and moral controversy.
Now, one of the touchiest subjects around this social mixing was the whole issue of mixed bathing. Apparently in the early days, back in the Republic, baths kept men and women strictly separate. But by the 1st century AD, sources suggest mixed bathing became more common, especially maybe in smaller or private baths.
And this practice immediately provoked a backlash from the more conservative elements in Roman society.
Absolutely. You get writers like the satirist Juvenal or the poet Martial and other traditional Roman moralists just railing against it. They saw public nudity, and especially men and women bathing together, as clear proof that society was going downhill, losing its moral compass. They'd often contrast this decadence with this idealized image of the good old days of the Republic, when Roman men were supposedly tougher, more focused on duty, less interested in luxury.
And the critique was quite specific. They argued that the whole atmosphere of the Thermae, the heat, the oil, the relaxed vibe, the nakedness, it just created a hotbed for inappropriate behavior, for licentiousness. The public bath, in their eyes, was where good Roman virtues went to die, replaced by sort of Eastern luxury and moral softness.
What's really interesting, though, is that even emperors seem to struggle to actually stop it.
That's right. Despite all the moral outrage and even attempts by emperors to clamp down, sources mention Hadrian, for instance, trying to officially bring back strict gender separation, it seems mixed bathing often just carried on. Sometimes openly, sometimes maybe more discreetly, but it persisted across the empire. It shows this ongoing tension between official rules or conservative values and popular custom. People just liked the relaxed atmosphere, apparently, more than they worried about the moralists' complaints.
The real genius of the huge imperial thermae was that they weren't just bathhouses. They were designed as these complete ecosystems, spreading across massive areas. Sources call them park-like precincts. They were built to cater to basically every need: intellectual, spiritual, commercial.
They were really designed as these self-contained worlds. The idea was that the elite could structure their whole afternoon there without ever needing to leave the complex. The range of services went way beyond just pools and steam rooms.
Like the libraries, for instance. Having libraries suggests they were aiming for more than just physical health.
Absolutely. Big complexes often included libraries, reading rooms, sometimes even separate ones for Greek and Latin texts. So a citizen could literally exercise, get clean, and do some serious reading or study all in the same visit. It really confirms the bath's role as a total civic center, not just a place to wash.
And they even included spaces for spiritual life. That shows how integrated these places were into all aspects of Roman life.
That's right. The complexes often made space for diverse religious practices. The sources point out that the baths of Caracalla, for example, had this beautifully preserved underground shrine, a Mithraeum, dedicated to the god Mithras. So you had religious worship happening right alongside exercise and bathing.
Commercially, it sounds like the thermae were basically mini shopping malls, too.
Pretty much. The surrounding areas and corridors would host little shops and stalls, tabernae, selling everything you might need for your visit or afterwards. Food, snacks, wine, perfumes, massage oils, strigils, sponges, you name it. And on top of that, the complexes often had stages or small auditoriums for performances, plays, poetry readings, musical concerts.
So putting it all together, libraries, gyms, temples, shops, performance spaces, this seamless integration allowed the Roman elite to just maximize their afternoon schedule. Total efficiency.
It really confirms the bath's ultimate purpose as this highly organized institutional space. You could hold a political chat in the palestra while maybe watching wrestlers, finalize a business deal in the warm tepidarium after your steam, grab a bite to eat, maybe listen to a poet, all without the hassle of moving around the busy city. It's centralized daily life, business, and leisure in one spot.
Okay, but concentrating all this activity, social, commercial, physical, into one place, well, it naturally attracted criticism, too. Conservative voices saw all the luxury, the noise, the sheer intensity as proof that society was fundamentally broken, decadent. You had figures like Cato the Elder attacking luxury, comparing it unfavorably to the good old rustic past, where, as Seneca later joked, real Romans hardly bathed at all, but they stank of heroism.
That quote really sums up the moralist view perfectly. For them, the Thermae weren't just wasteful, they were symbols of moral weakness, a turning away from true, tough Roman virtue.
But the most vivid, the most detailed, and honestly the most painful critique comes from the Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger. He gives us this incredible soundscape of the Thermae in his famous letter 56. He actually lived in an apartment right above a bathhouse for a while. It's just a catalog of urban chaos.
Seneca's account basically flips the script. It turns the bathhouse from this idealized place of leisure into a metaphor for just how noisy and chaotic Roman city life could be, maybe even a sign of failed urban planning. He complains bitterly that he couldn't get any quiet study done, and he lists this relentless barrage of specific disruptive sounds.
Yeah, walk us through those sounds again. It's not just general noise. He picks out really specific actions.
Exactly. He lists the grunts and strained breathing of weightlifters exercising downstairs, jucking heavy weights. That's the sound of physical effort. Then, the sharp slapping sound of masseurs, often slaves, hitting their clients' bodies, sometimes with oiled hands, sometimes bare. He even mentions the piercing shrieks of people having their armpit hair plucked out by depilators, which suggests even these painful services weren't properly soundproofed from the main areas.
Wow. And mixed in with those sounds of bodies being worked on were the sounds of the place itself and the commerce.
Precisely. The constant splashing of people diving into pools, the loud, nonstop yelling of vendors selling food, drinks, snacks, sausages, cakes, and just the general high-volume roar of conversation, arguments, gossip. He describes being constantly assaulted by this mashup of physical strain, sharp pain, and relentless selling.
So Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, he's looking for otium, peace, quiet, purposeful leisure. But instead, he finds himself drowning in Negotium, all the noise of business and frantic activity.
That's the core of his analysis. He was trying to find inner peace, trying to prove philosophically that external noise shouldn't disturb a wise person. But the sheer volume, driven by physical needs and commercial transactions, had completely overwhelmed any sense of tranquility. Even Seneca, the great Stoic, basically admits defeat and pragmatically concludes that maybe just moving house would be easier. His complaint really highlights the intense economic energy of the bathhouse, where the noise of commerce and labor had totally swallowed any ideal of peaceful leisure. Hashtag TAC 5.2, the decisive factors of decline.
So this golden age of the great public baths, at least in the Western Empire, it eventually ended. It seems like it was brought down by a combination of factors, big shifts in thinking, and just straight-up infrastructure failure.
Yeah, the first big challenge came from the rise of Christianity in late antiquity. As Christianity became more influential, church leaders started pushing hard for moderation, for austerity. They increasingly saw the whole public bath ritual as, well, a time-wasting luxury.
And it wasn't just about wasting time or money, was it? There was a deeper theological objection to the whole environment.
Yes. The fundamental problem for many church figures was the perceived moral danger. The public nudity, and especially the persistent mixed-gender bathing, was widely condemned as a prelude to sin. You get figures like Pope Gregory saying bathing should only be done when absolutely necessary for health, actively discouraging people from going just for pleasure or relaxation. This big ideological shift meant people started preferring private bathing, maybe at home if they could afford it, or in smaller segregated facilities. The massive public complexes lost their popular appeal and, crucially, their funding base.
What were the immediate effects of that pressure? Did the baths themselves change?
Well, as moral concerns grew and the huge running costs stayed the same, many baths, especially the smaller Balaneae, probably became more expensive and less popular. They were increasingly segregated by gender, maybe having separate days or hours for men and women. They gradually lost that status as truly universal civic hubs. Eventually, they might have only catered to the wealthiest citizens or those who could still afford the dwindling services.
But the final nail in the coffin for the really massive complexes, that wasn't ideology, was it? It was pure infrastructure collapse, often caused by outside forces.
It was basically targeted destruction, a kind of cultural warfare. These enormous thermae were completely dependent on a continuous, massive supply of water from those long-distance aqueducts. During the Gothic Wars in the 6th century, the invaders, particularly the Goths, led by Vitiges besieging Rome, understood this dependency. They deliberately cut the aqueducts supplying Rome and other major cities. Without water, the baths of Caracalla, for example, just couldn't function. They were forced to close permanently around 537 AD.
And the knock-on effects of cutting the aqueducts must have been huge, way beyond just losing your afternoon bath.
Oh, catastrophic. Cutting the aqueducts did two devastating things at once. First, it deprived the city's population of their central daily ritual and civic space. Second, and maybe even more critically, it stopped the flow of water that flushed the public sewers. Once the central Roman administration collapsed, the local towns and cities just didn't have the resources, the money, the engineers, the materials, the organized labor to repair and maintain these incredibly complex aqueduct and hypocaust systems. So the physical destruction of the water supply led directly to the abandonment of these massive complexes in the West. It ushered in centuries where public sanitation standards just plummeted.
So wrapping this all up, what's the takeaway for us today? The Roman Thermae were just this monumental achievement, weren't they? A really sophisticated combination of engineering, imperial power, and this very personalized, complex form of leisure that defined Roman urban life for centuries.
They really were the physical embodiment of Roman civilization and high culture. And although the huge complexes in the West eventually crumbled, the actual tradition didn't completely disappear. The idea of large-scale, social, communal bathing, that was picked up and adapted particularly by Byzantine culture and later Islamic societies. It heavily influenced the development of the hammam, the Turkish bath.
Architecturally, their influence is still visible today, right? even in buildings where you might not immediately think Roman bath.
Absolutely. Those classic Roman building techniques, especially the huge coffered concrete vaults they used to roof these enormous indoor spaces, and those distinctive large semicircular windows, the thermal windows first seen in the baths of Diocletian, they had a massive comeback during the neoclassical period. You can see echoes of Roman bath architecture in grand public buildings all over Europe and America. Think about big old train stations like Grand Central in New York. Those soaring vaulted halls definitely owe a debt to the scale and style of a Roman frigidarium.
It's really amazing how they figured out how to make these huge public buildings feel so grand, so aspirational, but also kind of personal at the same time.
And if you think about the bigger picture, the underlying appeal of the Thermae really connects with things happening today. We're seeing this huge resurgence in interest in social wellness, spa culture, curative waters, communal gathering spaces. These things are often marketed now as an antidote to modern loneliness and stress. In a way, this whole movement is just reasserting that timeless therapeutic and community value that the Romans first really codified in their bathhouses 2,000 years ago.
They basically invented the immersive social wellness industry, didn't they? And somehow convinced the state it was essential public infrastructure.
Indeed, they did. The Roman state poured resources into subsidizing bathing. They saw it as fundamental to defining what it meant to be a citizen, to maintaining public health, and, let's be honest, to projecting imperial power. Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. What modern civic amenity, what utility, or perhaps even luxury is so universally subsidized by our states today that if we suddenly lost it permanently, it would completely unravel the social fabric of our cities? Would it be public transport, the internet, maybe something even more basic we take for granted? Think about that the next time you walk past a grand old public building and consider the statement it was built to make.